There is a portrait that hangs, still above the cold grate in a low parlour at Nether Wallop, and it is worth pausing on before anything is said, for it tells the whole of the matter and none of it at once. It shows a family that was never rich and never quite poor, 3 generations of Hampshire churchmen with the same long, careful jaw, painted cheaply by a travelling hand who flattered none of them. There is a great-grandfather in bands and a grim collar, a grandmother with her hands folded over a Bible as though she meant to keep it from flying away. And at the edge, half cut off by the frame as the painter ran short of canvas, a young man who is no parson at all. He is turned a little aside, his coat plain, his eyes lifted not to the viewer but to some high window out of the picture. And in the crook of his arm he holds a thing the others plainly did not understand, a small brass instrument of tubes and graduated rings, a thing for measuring the sky. The family called him, when they spoke of him at all, Uncle Silas, who went away, and they spoke of him the way one speaks of a debt long since written off, with a shrug and a half-smile, as a fiction nearly, a cautionary shape, used to frighten the practical out of dreaming. There was a tale, much worn with telling, that he had quarrelled with his brother over a sum of money spent on lenses instead of land, and another that he had simply walked out one autumn morning to see an eclipse in the north and had never troubled to come back. The two were not held to be inconsistent. Marianne's own father, a gentleman who measured the world by the parish and the seed time and the price of wheat, had used to lift his eyes to that crooked corner of the portrait of a Sunday and say, mildly, that there went the family's portion of folly, all spent in one man, and that the rest of them might be the soberer for it, a joke so old it had stopped being a joke and become a kind of grace before meat. No one in that house living had laid eyes on him, no one expected to, and so the portrait hung and gathered the soft grey dust of a parsonage that could not afford to dust often, and the brass instrument in the painted hand caught what light there was and waited, as such things do, to be claimed by the one person in 3 generations who knew precisely what it was for. That person sat now beneath it, by the window, with the last good light of a January afternoon falling across her open page. Marianne Strickland, 28, slight and upright, with dark honey hair drawn back plainly under a half-mourning cap, grey eyes quick to the light, a parson's daughter of Nether Wallop in a grey and cream gown turned twice at the cuff. She had her pocket notebook open upon her knee, a worn small thing bound in scuffed calf, and she was setting down, in a hand far neater than her gown would have promised, the particulars of the moon. It wanted 3 days of the full. She had marked the gibbous swell of it the night before through the bare ash boughs, and she noted now the hour it would rise this evening, and beside that, in the older ink of last week, a line concerning Jupiter and the small bright satellites that strung themselves out from his side like beads off a thread. She wrote without hurry. The cold of the parlour did not reach her while she wrote. It never did. Other young women of her acquaintance kept commonplace books of receipts and verses and the dates of balls. Marianne kept the dates of the sky, the eclipses and oppositions, and the slow returns of things that did not care in the least for Hampshire, and chief among them, in pages worn soft with rereading, the recorded passage of the great comet that had hung over England in her girlhood, and which she had watched every clear night until it dwindled and was gone. She thought in such dates. She could not help it. When she was asked her own age, she was as like to give it by the comet as by the parish register, for the one seemed to her quite as fixed as the other, and a good deal more beautiful. It had been her one extravagance, this looking up, in a life that had room for very few. A borrowed glass with a crack across one lens, a chair carried out onto the cold churchyard grass, an hour stolen from mending after her father had gone to bed. She had taught herself the constellations from a torn almanac and the moons of Jupiter from a single evening's loan of a better instrument than she would ever own, and she had grieved more honestly over the comet's going than she had quite known how to grieve over the parishioners she buried, because the comet had at least promised to return, in some far year she had calculated and set down, and would very likely not live to see. The fire being all but out, and her father these 11 months in the churchyard, and her mother longer than that. There was no one to tell her to put the notebook by, and so it lay open when the knock came at the door. It was not a knock she knew. The parish knocks she knew, the heavy patient rap of the sexton, the timid scratch of the curate's boy, and this was neither. It was a brisk town knock, 2 raps and a pause, and a third, the knock of a man who has travelled and means to be admitted. She heard Sally go to the door, and a murmur, and then Sally at the parlour saying that there was a gentleman, a lawyer, come a great way and asking very particular for Miss Strickland by her name. Marianne closed the notebook on her finger to keep the place and rose. The gentleman who came in stooping under the low lintel was old, and travel had not improved him. The snow of the Shap Road, she would learn, was still in his very bones. Mr. Locksley, 63 of Wraysbury and Locksley in Kendal, thin and stooped in plain black, superfine, gold-rimmed spectacles, attentive grey eyes, 33 years at the law. He had a leather case under his arm such as carries papers and nothing else, and he held his hat against his breast, and he looked at her with a long, searching, almost startled attention, as a man looks who has carried an errand so far that he has half ceased to believe in the person at the end of it. He had been 4 days on the roads, the last of them through sleet, changing chaises at posting-houses where they had never heard the name of Strickland, and shaking his head over a direction that proved, at each turning, to be a year or 2 out of date. And he had begun, somewhere south of Oxford, to fear he should find at the journey's end either no such woman at all, or some flighty creature wholly unfit for what waited in the north. He looked at the slight, upright figure in the turned, cuffed gown, at the steadiness of her, at the small, worn book she had not let go of even to greet a stranger, and a portion of that fear went quietly out of him. "I must beg your pardon," he said when she had bid him sit, and Sally had been sent for what fire could be coaxed up. "Before I say anything else, Miss Strickland, I must beg it very heartily. I am come later than I ought. The fault is not all mine. The direction we held was an old one, and the world is wide, and a parson's family that removes twice in 20 years is not easily run to ground. But you have been heir to a thing these 4 months, and have not known it, and that is a wrong, however it came about. And I am the man before you who must own it. I am sorry to have reached you so late." "You have reached me," said Marianne. She had taken the chair across from him, and folded her hands, the notebook still between her fingers, and her voice was low and even and entirely without alarm. "That is the chief thing. Will you tell me, sir, whose man you are, and what it is I am heir to?" It was, he would think afterward, riding south again, an extraordinary way to receive such news. That quietness, that single plain question, where he had braced himself for tears or fluster or the long blank silence of a woman who does not understand. He had carried hard tidings to many doors in 33 years, and had learned to read the first moment of a face, the way a sailor reads the first cloud of weather. Hers told him almost nothing, save that there was a great deal behind it held very still. He drew the breath of a man coming to his proper business, and opened the leather case upon his knee. "I am, or was," he said, "man of law to your great-uncle, Mr. Silas Ainsworth, of Skelwith Howe in the county of Westmorland, who is dead." He watched the name go into her and waited to see what it would do, and what it did was small and strange. Her hands tightened the least degree upon the little book, and into her grey eyes there came not grief. She had never known the man, but a sudden close attention, as though a shape long thought painted on canvas had stepped down off the wall and into the room. "Silas Ainsworth," she repeated. "My uncle who went away. We were given to understand, that is, the family always said, that he was very nearly a story, that there was no such place and no such fortune, and that he had died poor abroad, if he had ever lived at all." "He lived," said Mr. Locksley with the ghost of a dry smile, "a very great while, and very much to his own purpose, and he died in his bed in October last, in a house upon a fell above the river Brathay, under a copper dome that he had built with his own money to hold a telescope, the equal of which, I am told, there is hardly another in the north of England. He was eccentric, he was not poor, and he was, Miss Strickland, by every line of the law I serve, your blood, and you, by the same lines, are very nearly the last of it." He drew out the document then, the engrossed will upon its stiff folded sheets, and he settled his gold spectacles, and he asked her leave to read it, as it stood, in its own words, that there might be no mistaking afterward what had and had not been said. And she gave it, and sat back, and let the lawyer's careful voice fill the cooling parlour with the legal music of the dead. "This is the last will and testament of me, Silas Edmund Ainsworth, of Skelwith How in the parish of St. Oswald in the county of Westmorland. Gentlemen, being of sound and disposing mind and memory, praise be to God, and of a clearer sight of the heavens than of mine own near affairs, which I do here own and lament. I revoke all former wills. I direct that my just debts and the charges of my burial be paid, and that I be laid in St. Oswald's churchyard, with no monument but a plain stone, and upon it, if the mason can be brought to cut it true, the figure of a comet, for reasons that concern me and the Almighty, and need concern no executor." Mr. Locksley paused, and glanced up over the gold rims, and found her listening with her whole grave face, the notebook of moons and comets still clasped shut beneath her folded hands, and read on. He read slowly as a man does, who has learned that the law's chief mercy is its plainness, and that a sentence misheard at such a moment may cost more grief than the loss it announces. "Whereas I have outlived my brother and my brother's son, and have no issue of my body lawfully begotten, and whereas in the long-looking I have done at distant things, I confess I have looked but coldly at the near ones, and have let the years carry off such of my kindred as might have sat at my table, and whereas I have lately, through inquiry, learned that there yet lives the daughter of my brother's son, one Marianne Strickland, the child of a clergyman of Hampshire, and that she is said to be a young woman of sense and of no fortune. Now therefore I give, devise, and bequeath unto the said Marianne Strickland, her heirs and assigns for ever, all that my capital messuage or mansion house, called Skelwith How, with the observatory and dome thereto lately built, and all the lands, closes, and appurtenances thereunto belonging, together with my brass refracting telescope, and all the lesser instruments, my star charts, my observation journals bound and unbound, and the whole of my library, and further, all my moneys in the public funds, to her sole use and benefit, freely and without condition." He read on through the lesser bequests, small sums to a housekeeper and a steward, and the poor of the parish, named with an exactness that surprised her in so unworldly a man, and through the appointment of himself, Edmund Locksley, as executor, and so to the attestation, the date, the witnessing hands, and there. And he folded the sheets again along their worn creases, and laid his own thin hand flat upon them, and the parlour was very quiet, and the cold light had gone amber at the window. Marianne had not moved. She had listened as she listened to the sky, with that still and total attention that gave nothing back, and only when he had quite finished did she ask her question. One question, levelly, the notebook still shut upon her finger. "There is no condition in it," she said. "Not that I should marry, nor keep his name alive, nor pull down the dome, nor preserve it. He has tied nothing to the gift at all." "Nothing whatever," said Mr. Locksley. "It is yours outright, to keep or to sell, to live in or to let. I have never in my life drawn a will so free of strings, and I told him so, and he said—" The old man hesitated, and then gave it her plainly, because she seemed a woman who would rather have the truth than the comfort. "He said that a creature kept too long under glass forgets how to fly, and he would not so serve his own blood. That was all the reason he would give me." And at that, for the first time, something moved behind the grey eyes. Not tears, for she did not weep, but a brightness, quick and warm, as when a long-watched star clears the edge of a cloud. She looked once, briefly, up at the cheap portrait above the dead grate, at the young man turned aside with the brass thing in his arm, and his painted gaze fixed on a window out of the frame, and she understood, all at once, and without a word said, exactly what he had been looking at, and that it had been the same sky she looked at herself, and that he had known of her, and reached across 40 years and the whole length of England to set this small brass world of his into her hands, precisely because he had guessed she would know what it was for. It was a strange thing, she thought, to be loved so particularly and so late by a man who had never once written to her, never sent so much as a line at a birthday, loved not for her face, which he had never seen, nor her manners, which he could not have known, but for a single guessed-at habit of looking upward in the dark. The family had been wrong about him then, in the one way that mattered. He had not gone away from them at all. He had only gone to where the looking was better, and kept watch, and waited to find someone worth handing the watch to. She rose and crossed to the window, and stood a moment with her back to the lawyer, looking north over the bare Hampshire fields to where, in 3 days' time, the full moon would come up, and when she turned again, her face had settled, and her mind plainly with it. "Then I shall go to it, Mr. Locksley," she said. "I shall go north and see the place, and the dome, and the telescope, before I decide anything at all about consols or selling or letting. A thing like that is not to be judged from Hampshire by a man's reading of a will, however kind. I should like to look through it myself." She glanced down at the little notebook still in her hand, and a small dry smile touched her mouth. "And I confess I am curious to know what a man could see, from a fell above a river, that he could not see from anywhere nearer to his family." "I had hoped you would say so," said the old lawyer, rising too, with the stiffness of the long road in him, and looking at her now with something that had warmed in the course of half an hour from duty into a plain and growing regard. "The journey is hard at this season. Shap is no friend to coaches in January, but Skelwith Howe is shut up and waiting, and the people there are honest, and I will see you safely north and stand your friend in the doing of it, for as long as you have need of one. You will want a friend at the law, Miss Strickland. Every woman of property does." He said it lightly, as a man rounds off a piece of business with a civil flourish, and she took it as lightly, for there was nothing in that quiet Hampshire parlour to give the words their weight. Neither of them could have told, that January afternoon, that he was promising her a thing she would one day need more sorely than either of them could yet imagine. They settled the practical matters between them in the failing light, the date of setting out, the inns upon the Shap road that might be trusted, the small sum he pressed upon her against the costs of travel, and would hear no refusing of, since it was hers now in any case, and 100 times over. He gathered the folded will back into its case, and tied the ribbon with the slow care of a man who has handled other men's last wishes for 33 years and never quite grown careless of them. She did not yet know how exactly, nor how soon, those words would come to be earned. The parlour held no shadow of it, no rival, no whisper of any other hand that might reach towards Skelwith How. There was only the dead grate, and the cooling room, and the comet cut crooked on a far gravestone she had never seen, and a young woman who had been a fiction's heir an hour ago, and was now mistress of an observatory she could not yet imagine. She gave Mr. Locksley her hand on it, and the matter was settled between them as plainly as a sum. She would go to Westmorland. She left Hampshire on a grey morning in the second week, with one corded trunk, the worn pocket notebook tucked into her muff, and a letter of credit from Mr. Locksley folded against her heart, and the slow business of getting north taught her the size of the country she had inherited a corner of. The mail took her up through a succession of towns whose names she had read only on maps, the inns changing under her like the pages of a book she had not chosen, and she kept her own counsel through all of it, watching the land lift and harden as the soft chalk of the south gave way to stone walls and bare green shoulders of hill. She did not weep, and she did not fret. She made small notes instead, of the hour the moon would rise that night and how high it would stand, of a clear patch of sky over a posting yard at dusk where Jupiter hung steady and unwinking above a chimney, and once, when a fellow passenger declared the bright thing low in the east to be a star, she said quietly that it was a planet and would not twinkle if he watched it, and then said no more. For she had learned young that the surest way to be thought odd was to be right out loud. By the third day, the coach was climbing in earnest, grinding up the long pull onto Shap in a wind that came off the moor with nothing to break it, the horses leaning into the collar and the guard stamping his feet on the roof, and the world up there was all one colour, a brown-grey waste of bent grass and standing stone and water lying black in the peat, with the cloud come down so close she might have put her hand into it. It was the loneliest place she had ever crossed, and yet she found she was not afraid of it. She pressed her face to the glass and watched the summit go by, and thought that a man who wished to see the heavens clearly would do well to live within reach of country like this, where no smoke of cities stood between the eye and the dark. Then the road tipped over and began its long fall toward the lakes, and the character of everything changed at once, the bold moor giving way to deep wooded becks and grey farmsteads tucked into folds of the fell, the air softening with the smell of bracken and wet stone and wood smoke, until at a turn above a river she saw the valley of the Brathay open below her, green and steep and crowded with trees, the water bright at the bottom of it, and knew without being told that she had come at last into her great-uncle's country. A hired gig met the coach at Kendal, where Mr. Locksley's chambers stood, though Locksley himself was away at the assizes and had sent only his clerk with directions and a key, and the last miles were the strangest of the whole journey, the lane narrowing between high banks until it was scarcely wider than the wheels, climbing always, with the fell rising sheer on the one hand, and the river loud and unseen below the trees on the other. Marianne sat very straight, with her gloved hands folded, and let the place come to her. The light was failing when the gig swung through a broken gateway, and the trees fell back, and Skelwith House stood up before her against the last of the sky, a long, low, grey house of the local stone, 2 stories and a huddle of older roofs behind, plain and weathered and stubborn-looking, set with its back to the rising ground as though it had grown out of the hill rather than been built upon it. But it was not the house she looked at first. Above the eastern wing, where the roof line ought to have run plain and slate-grey to its chimney, there rose instead a thing she had never thought to see, except in the engravings of foreign academies, a dome of weathered copper, gone soft green with the years, round and bold and incongruous against the fell-side, with a long shuttered slot let into the curve of it like a closed eyelid. She had the gig stopped, and she got down in the wet grass and stood looking up at it while the driver waited, and it was a long moment before she understood the catch in her own breath. Her great-uncle, whom she had been raised to believe a family fiction, a name invoked over the parsonage fire to explain why the Stricklands had once been almost grand, had built himself an observatory on the side of a Westmorland fell and left it to her. Only when she had counted the shutter and traced the line of the dome and fixed it in her mind did she let herself look at the lit windows below it, at the door standing open and the figure waiting in the light of it, and turn her thoughts at last to supper and a bed and the living people who kept the place. Mrs. Pendlebury, the housekeeper, near 60, grey and upright in black bombazine with the keys at her waist, 30 years in the house, came down the 2 worn steps into the dusk and curtsied and said only, "You'll be Miss Strickland. You're very welcome, and very like him about the eyes," before she took the trunk cord out of the driver's hand herself and called sharply for a boy. There was a comfort in being expected, in the warm gust of the hall as the door opened, in the smell of beeswax and wood smoke and old paper, and Marianne followed her in, past panelled walls hung dark with portraits she could not yet make out, into a low parlour where a fire had been built up and a cloth laid, and was made to sit and be fed before a single question of business was allowed to pass between them. She was grateful for it. She had not known how cold she was until the heat reached her, nor how far she had come until the housekeeper set a hand for an instant against her shoulder, the way an old servant will to a young mistress newly orphaned of all her near people, and said that the master had spoken of her, at the end, more than once. Marianne asked her one quiet question, whether her great-uncle had used the dome himself, latterly, or whether it stood shut, and Mrs. Pendlebury said he had gone up to it the very autumn before he died, on every clear night, wrapped to the eyes, and that no one had touched a thing in it since, by his order standing even now. Then she would let no more be said, and took the candle up, and showed her to a chamber under the eaves where the sheets had been warmed and a fire lit, and Marianne lay a long while listening to the unfamiliar house settle and tick around her, and the river running somewhere below in the dark, and slept at last without dreaming. In the morning the valley was full of light, and the business of the place began to show her its true size. Mr. Brand, the steward, a square weathered man of 50 in good brown broadcloth, plain-spoken and honest, who had walked the Skelwith Fells man and boy, came up to the house after breakfast with his hat in his hand and his account-books under his arm, and laid the whole of it before her at the parlour table without flourish or flattery, as a man lays out what is true. Skelwith How was hers, and all that belonged to it, the house and its gardens, and the home farm in the bottom, some 420 acres of the valley, the better land in meadow, and the rest in rough fell pasture, run with the hardy native sheep, the fishing of a stretch of the Brethay, 2 outlying farms let to tenants at rents that Brand read off without apology and without pride, and, beyond the land, a sum in the 3% consols that Locksley's letter had named, and Brand confirmed, enough, soberly handled, to keep the house standing and its people paid, and a gentlewoman in modest independence for the whole of her life, and then, last of all, set apart from the rest as a thing of no rent and no yield, and yet plainly the chief treasure of the estate in the steward's plain reckoning. The observatory itself, the great brass refracting telescope upon its mount beneath the dome, the racks of ground and polished lenses in their baize-lined case, and the long shelves of star charts and bound observation journals in the master's own hand, all of which, Brand said, touching them off on his thick fingers, the old gentleman had charged should pass entire and undivided to whoever came after him, and on no account be sold, nor broken up, nor carried away. Marianne heard him out, and asked him sensible questions about the tenants and the state of the walls and the price of wool, and made her own small notes in her notebook beside the ones already there about the rising of the moon, and thought that she could be content here a long while, in this stone house above its loud green river, with the dome over her head, and the dark coming clean down the fell every night unspoiled. It was that same afternoon, while she walked the kitchen garden with Mrs. Pendlebury and learned the names of the espaliered pears, that the thing happened which set its small cold weight against the whole of that contentment. A horseman had come up the lane, the boy reported, breathless. A gentleman who had not got down, who had asked at the south door whether the house had a new mistress, and seemed put out to be told that it had, and who had left a card and ridden off again without giving his business or staying to be received. Mrs. Pendlebury's face, which had been easy all the morning, went still in a way Marianne was learning to read, and she said nothing, but went in by the south door herself, and came back with the salver and held it out. The card upon it was good stiff stuff, a little soiled at one corner from the gentleman's glove, engraved in a heavy, old-fashioned hand, and Marianne picked it up and turned it to the light, and read the name printed there, a name that meant nothing whatever to her, and yet that the housekeeper plainly knew, for she stood very straight, with her keys quiet at her waist, and waited. Sir Goderic Vane, Marianne read aloud, and then again, more slowly, as though the syllables might give up some sense if she turned them over, and looked up the green length of the garden toward the lane where the horseman had gone, and asked the only question there was to ask. "And who, Mrs. Pendlebury, is Sir Goderic Vane, that he should ride all this way to be sorry I am here?" The answer, when it came, was no answer at all, only the careful turning aside of one who knows a great deal and wishes to say little. Mrs. Pendlebury took the card, back onto the salver as though it might mark her fingers, and said that Sir Goderic was a connection of the family, a cousin of sorts on the late master's mother's side, and that he had been used to come up to the house now and again in the old days, and had not always been made welcome, and that beyond this it was not her place to speak, and Marianne, who had been a parson's daughter long enough to know the shape of a silence kept out of loyalty, did not press her. But she put the name in her notebook that night. On the page after the one where she had written down the clearness of the air over the dome and the easy finding of the 4 small moons of Jupiter strung out along their line, and she underscored it once, plainly, the way she underscored a thing she meant to come back to and understand. It was not 3 days before she came back to it, for Sir Goderic Vane did not leave a second card. He came himself, and he came at the awkward hour after the noon meal, when the light lay flat and grey on the fells, and the river was loud below the terrace, and he came not alone, but with a second man behind him in a hired chaise, so that Mrs. Pendlebury, looking down from the landing window, had time to set her mouth and send the boy running for Mr. Brand before the wheels had stopped. Marianne received him in the small south parlour, because it was the room he had asked for by name, which told her something in itself, and she had time, while he was being relieved of his hat and gloves in the hall, to mark the careful neatness of her own grey and cream gown, and to close her notebook and lay it on the sill, and to compose herself into the stillness her father had taught her was worth more in a hard conversation than 100 words. Then the door was opened, and Sir Goderic Vane came in, and she had her first sight of the man who had ridden all that way to be sorry she was alive. Sir Goderic Vane, some 50 years, fleshy and high-coloured, a primrose-yellow waistcoat straining at its buttons, a quizzing glass swinging on a black ribbon, a soft, confiding voice that never quite reached his pale, flat eyes, came across the small room with both hands a little out from his sides as though he meant to take hers, and stopped just short of doing it, and bowed instead with a deal of creaking, and told her in tones of the warmest sorrow how very glad he was, how very glad indeed, to make at last the acquaintance of so near a kinswoman, and how he had grieved more than he could properly say, that the melancholy circumstance of their first meeting should be the loss of so dear a relation as poor Silas. "Cousin Marianne," he said, "for I shall make bold to call you cousin. Since cousins we are, you will let an old man sit. The road from Kendal shakes the bones. Cousin Marianne, you find me in two minds. Upon my honour you do, for I came here half resolved to be angry, and I find I cannot manage it. You are so very like her, so very like your great-aunt, as I remember her, that it quite unmans me." Marianne, who had never in her life heard her great-aunt named, and did not believe Sir Goderic had either, said that he was very good, and begged him to sit, and asked whether the gentleman with him would not also come in. The gentleman with him did come in, sidelong as though he would rather not, a sallow, nervous junior who kept dabbing his lip, and was named to her after a small delay as Mr. Pringle, Sir Goderic's man of law. And Mr. Pringle bowed twice where one bow would have served, and sat on the edge of the furthest chair, with a flat leather case held upright on his knees in both hands, and looked at the window. It was at this point, and not before, that Mrs. Pendlebury opened the door again, without being rung for, and announced that Mr. Wenlock was come up from the church, and might she bring him in, and Marianne, who had asked for no such thing, and understood at once that the housekeeper had sent for him on her own account, and meant her to have a witness in the room, said that she might, and was glad of it. Mr. Wenlock, the curate, a lean young man of 30 in worn black, ink on his fingers, a scholar's stoop, and a mild, attentive manner, who knew the parish registers by heart, came in quietly and took the chair nearest the door, and folded his stained hands, and said almost nothing for a long while, only watched, which was precisely what was wanted of him. So they were four in the small room, and the river going on below, and Sir Goderic settled himself with a great air of reluctance, like a man bringing himself by slow degrees to a duty he would give anything to escape. He praised the house. He praised the view. He said that poor Silas had always had an eye, always, even as a young man, for a thing of beauty, whether it were a prospect, or a piece of glass, or a fine instrument, and that it had used to be said in the family. Here he sighed, and turned the quizzing glass over once in his fat fingers, that Silas Ainsworth loved his stars better than his blood, which was a hard thing to say of any man, and one he himself had never countenanced, never, though there were those who had. And then, having laid this down so gently that it might almost have been a kindness, he came to it. He was grieved, he said, more grieved than he could tell her, that it should fall to him to be the bearer of an awkwardness, and at such a time, when she was new come and not yet settled and had no one by her of her own. But she was a sensible young woman, he could see that, sensible and composed beyond her years, and she would not thank him for wrapping a plain matter in soft words. The plain matter was this, that the estate of Skelwith Howe, which she had been given to understand was hers free and clear under poor Silas's last will, was not, he very much feared, so free nor so clear as the good Mr. Locksley had perhaps led her to suppose. There had been, he said, and here Mr. Pringle's hands tightened on the leather case, there had been an earlier arrangement, a settlement, made long ago, in the lifetime of Silas's father, binding the property in a particular line upon a particular failure of heirs, a line in which he, Sir Goderic, stood next, and Marianne did not stand at all, and that this settlement, being prior, must in law stand before any will, however lately and however affectionately made. I had hoped, he said, dropping his voice to its softest, to spare you the sight of the thing itself. But Pringle here is a stickler, are you not, Pringle, and tells me I do you no service by half measures. Show the lady the deed. Mr. Pringle did not at once show the lady the deed. He dabbed his lip, and opened the leather case, with fingers that were not quite steady, and drew out a single folded sheet of an old yellowed paper, and held it a moment as though weighing whether to part with it, and then laid it on the small table between them and drew back his hand quickly, the way a man draws his hand from a thing that may be hot. Marianne did not snatch at it. She let it lie a moment and looked at Sir Godric's high-coloured face composing itself into sorrow, and at Mr. Pringle looking hard at the window, and at Mr. Wenlock by the door very still, and then she drew the paper to her by one corner and unfolded it on the table and read it through, once, slowly from the top, the way Mr. Locksley had taught her without knowing he taught her, taking the whole of a document before fastening on any part. It was a deed of settlement, or made to look like one, in a stiff old secretary hand, much faded with the proper run of legal words, the whereases and the heirs mail, and the failing such, and a date, and 2 witness names, and at the foot a seal pressed into a wafer gone brown with age, and in the body of it, where the draftsman had wanted to fix beyond dispute the very night on which the deed was said to have been signed and sealed, he had reached, as country conveyancers sometimes did in those parts where no 2 clocks agreed, and a man dated things by the harvest or the fair, for a public wonder that all the valley had seen and could swear to, and he had written, in that faded, careful hand, that the settlement was made and executed upon the 3rd night of the great Comet's passage over the western fells, in the autumn of the year named above. Marianne read that line, and read it again, and felt something go very quiet, and very cold, and very exact inside her. The particular stillness she knew from the dome on a clear night, when a thing she had been waiting hours for swam at last into the field of the glass, exactly where her figures had told her it must be, for she knew the great comet. She had it in the notebook on the sill, not 10 feet from her hand, copied out years ago in her own girl's writing from her great-uncle's printed observations that she had once thought a family fiction, the dates of its first showing low in the east, of its brightening, of its long nights at the full of its tail across the autumn sky, of its fading and its last faint setting. And the autumn written on this paper, the year set down so confidently at the head of the deed and leaned upon so heavily in its body, was not the autumn of the comet at all. It was a full 12-month wrong. The comet that this careful old hand swore had blazed over the western fells on the night the seal was pressed had not yet risen that autumn, would not rise for another whole turn of the seasons, was at the date upon this paper, still somewhere out beyond the reach of any glass in England, uncome, unseen, unrecorded by any soul in the Brathay Valley, or anywhere else under heaven. The deed dated itself by a light that had not yet been in the sky. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name, knew it, the way she knew the moon would be at the half that night, and where Jupiter would stand at 10 o'clock. And she said nothing. She did not lift her head and say it. She did not let it reach her face, which had been schooled by a lifetime of sitting still in a cold church under her father's eye. She folded the paper again along its old creases, slowly, giving herself the time, and laid it back upon the table, and only then looked up at Sir Goderic Vane, who was watching her now with his pale, flat eyes, for all his sorrowing mouth, watching to see whether the thing had gone home. "I see that it is a serious paper," she said in a level voice, "and that it deserves a serious answer. You will not expect me, Sir Goderic, to give you that answer this afternoon, across a tea-table, upon a single reading. A matter of this weight must go to my own man of law." Sir Goderic spread his hands and said that nothing could be more proper, nothing in the world, that he had looked for nothing else from so sensible a young woman, and that he was entirely content, entirely, to leave the deed, or a true copy of it, in Mr. Pringle's keeping until her people could examine it at their leisure. Though he hoped, he said, his voice going soft and confiding again, that she would not be ill-advised by some sharp attorney into a long and costly resistance against what was, after all, only the plain old settled justice of the case, and that she would let an older and a fonder head persuade her, in the end, to a friendly arrangement that should leave her comfortable and want no scandal. Marianne said that she was obliged to him for his concern, and that her man of law was Mr. Locksley of Kendal, and that she would write to him this same hour and ask him to come up to Skelwith How as soon as he was able, and that until Mr. Locksley had seen the paper, she would say neither yes nor no, nor anything at all upon the substance of it. And at the name of Locksley she saw Mr. Pringle's hands move on the empty leather case, and saw Sir Goderick's smile hold itself a half-second too long before it spread, and was glad, with the same cold, exact gladness, that she had named him. Mr. Wenlock rose from his chair by the door, then, and said, in his mild scholar's voice, that if a copy were to be left, he should be happy to attest it had been compared with the original before the company, since he was by way of being used to old hands and faded inks among the registers, and it was as well such things were done regularly from the first, and Sir Goderick said heartily that it was very well thought of, very well indeed, though something behind his eyes did not say it. So the copy was made, slowly at the table, Mr. Pringle writing and Mr. Wenlock standing at his shoulder, reading each line over against the original aloud in his quiet voice, and Marianne heard the wrong year spoken twice more in that flat little room, the comet's false autumn read out plain into the loud afternoon, and held her peace and let it pass, and only watched the curate's mild face to see whether he, who knew so many dates by heart, had caught at it. But Mr. Wenlock read the year as he read all the rest, evenly, and gave no sign, and she could not yet tell whether he had marked it or not, and she would not be the one to point. There would be a time to point. It was not now, across a tea-table with the man's pale eyes on her, waiting for her to spend her one true card too soon. When at last the copy was attested and folded, and the original gone back into Mr. Pringle's leather case, and the case shut upon it, Sir Goderick heaved himself up with a great show of effort, and a great many further professions of his grief and his goodwill, and his hope of a friendly end, and took her hand, after all, between both of his, which were soft and damp, and held a half-instant longer than she liked, and said that he should do himself the honour of calling again very soon, when she had taken advice, and that he trusted he should find her then in a kinder, a wiser, a more yielding humour. Marianne said only that she would be guided by Mr. Locksley, and drew her hand back, and saw him to the door of the parlour, but no further, and let Mrs. Pendlebury, grey and upright with her keys, see him and his sallow man out into the grey afternoon and the waiting chaise. And when the wheels had ground away down the lane, and the house was its own again, she did not go straight to her writing-table, though Locksley must be written to within the hour. She crossed first to the window, and took up her worn notebook from the sill where she had laid it, and turned to the page in her own girl's hand, years old, where the great Comet's nights were set down, one under another in a column she had copied so long ago, she had half forgot she had them. And she ran her finger down the dates, the first showing, the brightening, the long full nights, the fading, the last faint setting, and read them over against the year that man had written on his paper and left ringing in the room, and made certain, quite certain, with the slow care she gave to a reckoning that mattered, that she was not herself mistaken. She was not mistaken. The dead astronomer, her great-uncle, whom she had believed a family fiction and now owed a roof and a glass and a copper dome, had in his lifetime fixed the comet's passage so exactly, night by night, that no living forger could shift it by a 12-month, and not be caught by anyone who had once troubled to read him. Sir Goderick Vane had reached for the surest landmark in the valley's memory to anchor his lie, and had got the year of it wrong, and did not know that he had, and had laid the proof of his own undoing on her tea-table, with his own soft, damp hands. Marianne closed the notebook upon the column of dates and stood a moment looking out at the dome upon the roof, going dark against the failing fell, and then she sat down and trimmed a pen and drew a sheet toward her and began, in her plain, upright hand, to write to Mr. Locksley at Kendal. Not what she knew. She set down not one word of the comet, of the year, of the lie, but only that a Sir Goderic Vane had called and produced a deed of settlement claiming the estate before her, and that she begged Mr. Locksley would come up to Skelwith Howe with all the speed he could make, for she had need of his counsel upon a serious paper, and would say the rest to him when he came. She let the paper lie a moment longer in the centre of the table, under the 4 pairs of eyes, before she touched it. There was no haste in her at all. There had been none from the first, and the want of it was beginning, she could feel, to tell upon Sir Goderic Vane, who had come expecting either a woman in tears or a woman in a temper, and had got instead a quiet one who asked questions. She drew the document a little nearer with one finger, turned it so that the window light fell square upon the close brown writing, and read again the sentence on which the whole of his claim was made to turn, the sentence that fixed the date of his pretended settlement, as such old country deeds so often were fixed in the memory of unlettered witnesses, not by the calendar, but by the great public event that had stood over that season like a lamp. The night, the paper said, in a phrase got up to sound like the speech of plain men, when the great comet hung above the fells and was seen of all the valley, and beneath that flourish, set down in figures as if figures settled anything, the year. Marianne looked at the year a long, mild moment. Then she lifted her head and looked, not at Vane, but at Mr. Locksley, who sat at her right hand with his gold-rimmed spectacles pushed up and his attentive grey eyes going from her face to the paper and back, and at Mr. Wenlock beyond him, the lean young curate, with the ink still on his fingers and the parish registers, as it were, written behind his eyes, and last, briefly, at the sallow, nervous junior at Vane's elbow, Mr. Pringle, who had not stopped dabbing at his lip with a folded handkerchief since he had come into the room. "May I ask," she said, in the even voice she used for asking the hour of a moonrise, "whether Sir Goderic stands upon this date, upon this year, written here as the year the comet passed? For the document does, very plainly. The whole of it hangs from this one night. I should like to be sure we are agreed that it is the comet, and this year that the claim rests on before I say what I have to say." Vane spread his fleshy hands upon the table, the quizzing glass swinging once on its black ribbon, and gave her the soft, confiding smile that never reached his pale, flat eyes. "The comet, ma'am, the very comet. There is not a soul in this dale above 40 years who does not remember the night of it, the whole sky lit, the dogs uneasy, the old folk on their knees. It is the surest date in the county. A man may forget the year his own father died, but not the year of the comet. That is the beauty of such a reckoning, dear lady. It cannot be mistaken." He said it warmly, generously, as a man lays down a winning card and is sorry for his opponent. And Mr. Pringle beside him gave a small, unhappy nod and looked at the table. "And so the settlement, made and witnessed upon that night, stands prior to any disposition my late cousin Ainsworth may afterward have pretended to make in your favour, and the house, the land, and all that is in it, including," he added, with the faintest dip of the chin toward the window and the copper dome beyond it, "that costly toy upon the roof come to me, who am the elder line, by a title older than your great-uncle's whim. It cannot be mistaken," Marianne repeated, slowly, as though tasting the words, and she reached down beside her chair to where her reticule lay, and drew out from it not a lawyer's brief nor a deed, but the small scuffed calf notebook she carried everywhere, the worn pocketbook of moon phases and the satellites of Jupiter and the long patient record of the sky. and she laid it open upon the table beside Vane's grand soiled paper, the one small and shabby and crammed with a neat private hand, the other broad and brown, and got up to look ancient, and the contrast of them was not lost on any man at that table. You are quite right, Sir Goderic, that the comet cannot be mistaken. It is the one thing in this whole business that cannot. A settlement may be forged, a witness may be bought, or may misremember. A year may be set down wrong by an honest clerk, and no one the wiser for a generation. But the comet kept its own appointment, and it kept it to the night, and the night is written, not in my book only, though it is in my book, here copied from the almanacs when I was a girl, and verified against 3 observers since, but written in the heavens, where no man's pen can reach to alter it. She turned a leaf, and another, with an unhurried finger. The great comet did not pass in the year your paper names. It passed a full 12-month later. Your document dates the night of the comet a whole year before the comet came. The sky was empty over these fells in the year you have written. There was nothing in it to bring the dogs uneasy or the old folk to their knees. You have dated your proof, Sir Goderic, by an event that had not yet happened. There was a silence in the room of a particular quality, the silence of men recalculating. Vane's high colour did not go all at once. It went in patches, the way colour leaves a man who is not used to being checked and is groping for the place where the floor has shifted. A trifle, he began, a slip of the clerk's pen in the year, the substance of the matter, the comet, the night, the witnesses. The substance of the matter is the date, said Mr. Locksley very quietly, and for the first time he sat fully upright and drew the paper toward himself, and the 33 years of the law were suddenly all there in his thin, stooped figure. A settlement is its date, Sir Goderic, as a man is his birthday. All to the year, and you have not a flawed instrument, but a different instrument, purporting to be made on a night that did not exist as your own document describes it. You have not given us a deed with an error in it. You have given us a deed that describes a sky that was not there. He set the spectacles down on his nose and read the offending line aloud, flatly, twice, and let it lie. Observe further. He went on, in the same dry, deliberate tone, tapping the brown paper once with a thin forefinger, that your witnesses are made to swear they saw the comet on this night, with this very year against their names. A man who never saw the thing he swears to is no witness, and a deed that hangs upon the testimony of men sworn to a sky that was empty is a deed that hangs upon nothing. I do not say it is a forgery, Sir Goderic. I say only that no court will take it as anything else, and that I should be sorry to be the man who carried it before one. And he folded his hands and waited, with the patience of a man who has watched a great many claims discover, in just such a silence, that they have no bottom. It was here that Marianne did the thing that finished it, and she did it gently, almost as a kindness, turning to the young curate. Mr. Wenlock keeps the registers of St. Oswald's, and reads more than registers. The passage of the comet was preached upon in this very parish. There is a sermon of it, is there not, entered and dated. Wenlock, who had been leaning forward with the particular hunger of a scholar watching a thing come right, said that there was, that the then incumbent had preached upon the comet as a sign, and had noted the very Sunday, and that he had read the entry not a fortnight since, and could fetch the book within the hour, and that the date of that Sunday agreed, to the season and the year, with the lady's reckoning, and not at all with the paper on the table. And the burials of that 12-month, he added, warming, are entered in a hand, I know, with the comet nowhere among them, for it had not yet come. The register will say the same as the sky. 2 witnesses then, the heavens and the parish books, and between them not a finger's breadth of room for a clerk's slipped pen. But it was upon Mr. Pringle that the whole weight of it at last came down, and Marianne, who missed little, had been watching him grow paler by the sentence. Vane turned to his man of law now with something less than confidence, and said, in a voice that tried for command and got only urgency, "Pringle, you drew this. You will speak to it. The date is sound. Tell them the date is sound." And the sallow junior, who had perhaps half believed his own client until the comet was set against the calendar before 4 witnesses, dabbed once more at his lip and looked at the small worn notebook and at the old solicitor's level face and at the curate already half risen to fetch his register, and could not do it. "I, Sir Goderic," he said, and his voice cracked upon the name. "I cannot vouch the date. I will not put my name to the date. If the comet's year is as the lady says, and as the parish book will show, then the instrument fixes itself by a night that the document's own terms cannot support, and I cannot stand up in any court in England and swear to it. I am sorry, I cannot." And having said it, he sat down very fast, as a man sits who has at last set down a weight he should never have agreed to carry, and looked at no one. That was the end of it, though Vane took a little while yet to understand that it was the end. He blustered some moments more, spoke of memory, of the unreliability of women in matters of figures, of his elder line and his bond, and the great expense to which he had been put, and once, very nearly, of going to law in earnest. But the words had no flaw under them now, and he could hear it himself, the hollow sound they made falling. He tried, even, to turn it back upon her. Said it was a strange thing, was it not? A most singular and convenient thing, that a young woman should chance to carry in her reticule the very almanac law to overthrow a gentleman's deed, and let the insinuation hang there a moment, that there was something unwomanly in it, something got up. Marianne did not take it up as an insult, which was perhaps the worst he could have suffered. She answered it as if it had been a question of fact. "It is not strange at all, Sir Goderic. I have kept the dates of the sky since I was 9 years old, as other girls keep the dates of their cousins' marriages. There is nothing in my book that is not in any printed almanac of those years, which you might have consulted as easily as I, had your case wished to be consulted. The comet's year is no secret of mine. It is only that I troubled to look, and you troubled to guess. And there being no answer to that, he made none." Marianne did not raise her voice through any of it, nor rise from her chair, nor allow herself the smallest triumph. She sat with her notebook open before her and her hands quiet upon the edge of the table, and let the silence and the law and the sky do the work, and answered the 1 or 2 of his sallies that were genuine questions with the same plain courtesy she would have shown a stranger asking the road. It was the composure, in the end, quite as much as the comet, that defeated him. There was nothing for his oiliness to take hold of, no grief to play upon, no anger to provoke into some rashness he might turn to account, only a calm young woman with a worn book and an old solicitor and a parish register, against whom bluster was as useless as a forged date against the unforgeable stars. When at length he gathered his great soiled paper from the table, Mr. Locksley's hand, resting upon it a deliberate moment first, so that Vane should understand, he took it up only by leave, and folded it away into his breast, and rose, the primrose waistcoat straining, and said that he washed his hands of an ungrateful connection and a beggared inheritance, and would trouble them no further. No one at the table troubled to contradict him. Mr. Pringle rose too, with his eyes down, and at the door turned and made Marianne a small, awkward bow that had a kind of apology in it, the only honest thing his side had brought into the house. She inclined her head to him gravely in return. Then the south door closed upon the pair of them, and the sound of the horses going down the lane came up faint through the window, and dwindled, and was gone into the noise of the river, and the room let out its breath. Mr. Locksley took off his spectacles and polished them upon a square of black silk, and looked at Marianne with something that in so dry a man came very near to wonder. "I have practised at the law 33 years," he said, "and I have seen claims broken by witnesses and by writs and by the long purse, but I never yet saw one broken by the firmament. You knew it the moment he laid the paper down, did you not yesterday, when he first read out the date? You said nothing then." She closed her notebook over her finger, keeping the place, and was a moment answering. "I wish to be sure," she said. "A thing one knows in one's own book is not yet a thing one can prove to other men. I wanted the sky and the register to say it too, both of them, so that it should not rest upon a woman's word against a gentleman's deed, for I knew well enough how that is weighed. The comet was certain to me from the first. But certainty is not evidence until it is witnessed. My great-uncle taught me that, though I never met him, in every page he kept. He never set down what he had not seen twice." And she looked, as she said it, toward the dark stair that went up to the dome, and the brass instrument waiting under it, with a look the old man had now no doubt at all how to read. With Sir Goderic gone down the lane for the last time, his paper undone by the very stars he had thought to forge, the house seemed to let out a breath it had been holding since the night the card was left, and the quiet that came after was not the quiet of suspense, but the quiet of a thing settled. Marianne did not mark the victory with any show. She put the contested settlement and Locksley's careful copies of it away in the iron box where her great-uncle had kept his almanacs, and she turned with the deliberate calm that was her whole nature to the slower work of belonging to the place rather than merely holding the title to it. For a fortnight after the claimant's defeat, she did very little but learn the shape of her days. When the post came up from Kendal, and when it went down, which of the kitchen chimneys smoked in a south wind, how long it took the morning light to climb from the foot of the meadow to the lower windows. And in that fortnight she came to understand that an estate is not its acres or its consols at all, but its people, and that she had inherited a parish along with a house, and was expected, quietly and without fuss, to take up her station in it. She went first, as was right, to the church. St. Oswald's stood half a mile up the fell from the How, a small grey building older than anything else in the valley, its squat tower set into the slope, so that one came down to the porch rather than up to it, the churchyard crowded with leaning slate headstones green on their north faces, and the names upon them worn nearly smooth by the weather coming off the tops. Her great-uncle lay there, under a plain new stone she had not yet seen, and she stood a long while before it on her first Sunday, reading the dates and finding that the only thing carved beneath his name and his years was a small incised star, cut deep, with no word of explanation, as though whoever had ordered it had understood that the man needed none. The curate met her at the Lich Gate after the service, ink still faintly on his fingers from the week's copying, and they fell into talk as easily as if they had known one another a long while. For Mr. Wenlock had been her ally in the matter of the forged date, and had stood in the parlour as a witness when the wrong year was read aloud off Vane's paper, and there was between them already the particular friendship of two people who have watched a lie pulled apart by the truth. He walked her down the fell path that morning, and told her, without being asked, a good deal she was glad to know, that the living was a poor one, and the congregation small and scattered, shepherds and their families mostly, with a handful of statesmen farmers, who held their own land and sat in the front pews and counted themselves gentry, that her great-uncle, for all his strange dome and his nights out under the cold, had been a regular communicant and a generous one, and had paid out of his own pocket for the school that met 3 mornings a week in the vestry, and that the old man had spoken of her, the curate said, more than the housekeeper perhaps knew, for he had lent Wenlock books and argued with him over Greek and over the calendar, and had once said, folding away a star chart, that he had a great niece in the south who would understand all this better than any of them, if ever she were given the chance. Marianne kept her face composed at that, as she kept it at most things, but she asked the curate one careful question, whether her great-uncle had ever spoken of when, or why, he had come to think of her at all. A girl he had never met, and Wenlock said no, only that he had spoken of her as a settled fact, the way a man speaks of an heir, and had seemed to take a quiet pleasure in the certainty of it. She turned that over for some days afterward, for there was something in it she could not yet account for, a knowledge running ahead of any acquaintance. But she set it by, as she set most things by, to be looked at when there was light enough to see it clear. The school she took up at once, and it became the steady centre of her week. 3 mornings she walked up to the vestry and read to the children gathered there on the cold benches, 11 of them and then 14, as word went round the dale that the new mistress of the How came herself, and did not send a servant, the smallest of them shepherds' children, who had walked 2 and 3 miles down off the fell in all weathers, with their dinner tied in a cloth. She read them the plain things first, the psalms and the easy fables, but she found her own pleasure in it only when she began, almost against her better judgment, to tell them what she truly knew. For one raw morning, a boy asked her, pointing through the deep little window at the daylit moon, hung pale and gibbous over the eastern ridge, why the moon should be out when the sun was, and whether it was broken, and she set down the book and answered him, and found 14 faces turned up to her in a silence quite unlike the silence of the Psalms. She took the broken bit of chalk and drew upon the slate the round of the earth and the round of the moon, and the long way the light came to them both, and told them that the moon was no more broken than a face is broken for being half turned from a window, that it carried always its own night upon the one cheek, and its own day upon the other, and that what they saw of it depended wholly upon where they themselves were made to stand. The boy who had asked frowned at the slate with the particular gravity of a child who has been given a true thing instead of a soft one, and asked after a moment whether the moon could see them back, and she answered him in good earnest that she did not think it could, but that her great-uncle had held a man might come to feel watched over by what he watched, if he watched it long enough and faithfully enough, and that this was as near to being seen by the sky as she supposed a person was likely to come. The vestry was very still while she spoke, the cold benches creaking, the deep little window letting in the pale disk of the daylit moon as though to bear her out, and she understood that she had given the Dale's children, without quite meaning to, the same gift a torn almanac had once given a freezing parson's daughter on a churchyard lawn. After that she brought her worn pocket notebook to the vestry along with the Testament, and showed them, with chalk on the slate, why the moon changed her face through the month and kept always the one side toward them, and which of the bright points in the winter dark were planets that did not twinkle, and which were the fixed stars that did. And Mr. Wenlock, looking in one morning, leaned in the doorway, with his arms folded and his scholar's stoop, and said, mild and amused, that he believed she would have the whole parish reckoning by Jupiter's moons before Lady Day, and that he for one would not be sorry. She laughed at that, which she did not often do, and said it would do them no harm to know where they stood in the order of things, and went on with the lesson. The home farm she came to know through Mr. Brand, who had laid the estate before her so plainly on her first morning, and who now, finding her willing to be taught, took an evident satisfaction in walking her over it. And a good deal of her first weeks was spent in stout boots and an old cloak in the company of the steward, learning the difference between the meadow that would carry a beast through winter and the rough fell pasture that would only feed the hardy native sheep, watching the men build a fallen length of wall, back up out of its own scattered stones, without a dab of mortar, standing in the low byre while Brand ran his hand down a beast's flank and named its faults to her without sparing them. He showed her how a wall, that looked to a southern eye like a heap of tumbled rubble, was in truth a reckoned thing. Each stone weighed in the hand and turned until it found the one seat it would keep through frost and gale, the heart of the wall packed tight with the very rubble a careless builder would have thrown aside, so that the whole stood 100 years on nothing but its own good arrangement and the lie of the ground. And Marianne, listening, thought that it was not so far from her own work after all, this patient setting of weighed particulars one against another, until they held and said as much, and saw the steward's weathered face warm with the pleasure of being understood. He taught her the names the dale gave its own ground, the intakes and the allotments, and the rough common, grazing up on the tops where the hardy native ewes ran half wild and knew their own hef and would not stray off it, though no wall stood between them and 40 miles of fell. And he told her, as they came down past the river meadow, with the light going long and amber, which fields would carry a beast through a hard winter, and which would only break a man's heart and his hay, speaking of it all in the unhurried way of one who had walked that ground man and boy, and reckoned to lie at last in the churchyard above it. He treated her neither as a fine lady to be flattered, nor as a child to be managed, but as the owner of a thing he loved, who had a right to understand it and a duty to keep it whole, and there grew up between them something near to what she had lost when her father died, a plain affection carried on under the cover of business. He was the one who told her, late one afternoon as they came down off the high ground with the light going amber along the tops, that the master had used to do just this: walk the fell at the day's end and then go straight up to the dome without his supper if the sky promised clear, and that the people in the bottom had taken the green-lit slot of the observatory for a kind of weather-glass, a sign the old gentleman judged it a fair night, and Marianne said nothing to that either, but she looked up at the copper dome standing dark and shut against the evening, and she knew, with the quiet certainty she brought to most decisions, that she had let it stand closed long enough. She went up to it that same night. Mrs. Pendlebury found her a second lamp and a heavier shawl without a word of objection, only the small, still expression that meant she approved and would not say so, and Marianne climbed the narrow stair in the eastern wing alone, past the shut doors of rooms she had not yet opened, to the round chamber under the green copper where her great-uncle had spent the last clear nights of his life. Nothing had been moved. The great brass refractor stood on its mount in the middle of the floor, long and cold and beautiful, capped against the dust. The star charts hung curling on their pins. The observation journals stood in their long row on the shelf, a quarter-century of nights in a dead man's hand. She did not touch the telescope that first night, not yet. She only drew back the shutter on its old greased runners, with a groan of metal that she felt in her teeth, until the slot stood open on a band of hard black sky, pricked thick with stars, the air pouring in cold and clean off the fell, and she stood in it and let her eyes widen to the dark, as she had taught herself to do years ago on the parsonage roof, and named to herself what she could see. The great square low in the west, the chained lady above it, the small misty patch beside her that was no star at all but something farther and stranger. Then she sat down at the little desk below the shelf and opened her own worn pocket notebook to its first clean page, and after a moment's stillness she dipped the pen and began, in the small upright hand she had kept since girlhood, to log the night, the date, the hour, the clearness of the sky, the planets up and the moon's age, exactly as she had done in Hampshire, under a meaner sky, exactly, she understood now, as the old man on the shelf above her had done 10,000 times in this same chair. It was the first entry she had made since the long road north had broken her habit, and making it, she felt the broken thread of her own life take up again and run on. After that, the lamp in the dome became a part of the valley's nights, as her great-uncle's had been. On any clear evening, the green slot would show its faint glow up on the side of the fell, and the shepherds coming home late would mark it the way their fathers had, and a child in the vestry told her gravely one morning that her mother had said the old gentleman was back, which the child plainly did not believe and reported only to see what the new mistress would say. And Marianne said that the old gentleman was where he had chosen to lie, up by the church, but that someone was indeed keeping his fire alight for him, which seemed to satisfy the child entirely. She went up most fine nights now, and her own journal began to fill, and the parish grew so used to the lamp that on the rare clear night it did not show. Brand would ask at the farm whether the mistress were unwell. It was in the want of company through the long climbing dark of those evenings, more than from any loneliness she would have confessed to, that the last of her circle came to her, and came, characteristically, by Mrs. Pendlebury's quiet contrivance, rather than by any asking of Marianne's own. The housekeeper observed one morning, while she counted the linen, that her sister's girl was come of an age to want a place, and had been schooled better than her station, being a great reader, and that if the mistress wished for someone to sit with her of an evening and read aloud, there was no need to send away to an agency in Kendal for a stranger when there was a steady girl of her own blood within 4 miles. So Miss Hattie, Mrs. Pendlebury's niece, 23, brown-haired and brisk in grey stuff, a quick, neat reader, came up to the How with her box on a borrowed cart, and was installed within the week, and the easy understanding between the two young women was settled almost as quickly as the friendship with the curate had been. Marianne had feared, a little, a girl who would chatter or who would be cowed, but Hattie was neither. She read aloud in the South Library of an evening, in a clear, unhurried voice that did not stumble over the long words, nor try to dress them up. The travels and the histories, and now and then a volume of her great-uncle's that touched on the heavens. And when she came to a thing she did not understand, she stopped and asked, plainly and without shame, which Marianne found she liked better than any false ease. They fell quickly into a shape of evening that suited them both, the fire built up, the candles drawn close, Hattie reading until the sky cleared, or the clock told 9, and then, on the fine nights, the book set down and the two of them going up together into the cold of the dome, where Hattie learned to handle the lamp so as not to spoil the dark and to read off the time and the temperature while Marianne sat to the telescope. The two of them came, over those weeks, into the wordless understanding of people who work a thing together in the cold and the dark, where a hand put out is filled before it is asked, and a figure called for is given before the asking is done. And Hattie, who had begun by holding the lantern at arm's length as one holds a thing one does not trust, came to move about the round chamber as surely as she moved about the still room below, knowing without being told which shutter cord ran smooth and which wanted easing, and learning to shade the flame with her body, so that her mistress's eye, widened to the dark over a patient half-hour, should not be spoiled by a careless gleam. They spoke little up there, for the watching did not want talk, but the silence between them was the friendly sort that asks nothing of either, and now and again Hattie would draw in her breath at some bright thing swimming into the field of the glass, and Marianne would name it for her, lo, the way one names a thing in church. And the girl who had come up the lane with her box on a borrowed cart, expecting only to read aloud of an evening and be civil to a great lady, found that she had been given a share in something she had not known the world contained, and was the gladder of her place for it than any wage could have made her. The girl had no learning in it, and made no pretence of any, but she had a steady hand and a true eye and an honest curiosity, and within a month she could find the bright planets unprompted, and had begun, of her own accord, to keep the running record of the nights in a fair clerk's hand while Marianne watched, so that the mistress's eye need never leave the glass. So her household was made whole, the housekeeper at its heart, the steward on its land, the curate at its church, and the brown-haired girl at her elbow in the cold under the open slot, and for the first time since the will had been read in the Hampshire parlour, Marianne Strickland was not merely the holder of Skelwith Howe, but a woman settled into the whole working of it, with her days full, and her nights given back to her, and the broken thread of her watching taken up again under a clean black sky. And it was only later, when she came at last to open the long row of her great-uncle's own journals on the shelf above her desk, that she would learn how much further back than her arrival the old man's interest in her truly ran, and find written there in his patient hand a night she had no memory of and yet had every reason to know. It was Miss Hattie who carried the candles up the night the second thing was found, for the evenings had drawn long and easy since Vane had gone, and the two of them had fallen into the habit of climbing to the observatory after supper to set the journals in order. Not to sell them, never that, but to know them, to lay the old gentleman's years out on the long table beneath the dome, and learn the hand and the method of the man who had left her everything. The volumes ran back further than Marianne had supposed, 34 of them in stiff marbled boards, each spine lettered in faded ink with its span of years, and they had begun at the near end with the autumn before his death, and worked backward through the seasons of his watching as one walks back through a life. Marianne read them the way another woman might have read letters from a lover, slowly, for the pleasure of the turning, following the great comet through its recorded passage, night by night, in the steady columns of his observation, the hour, the altitude, the bearing taken off the fell, the length and lean of the tail as it grew and faded, and finding in the margins, where another astronomer would have set only figures, the small, dry human notes of a solitary man, that the frost had cracked the cistern, that the dog had died, that he had drunk the year's last bottle of his brother's port to the Comet's health and found it gone to vinegar. There was a whole man in those margins, she came to see, set down all unawares between the columns of figures. A man who noted on one freezing January leaf that his fingers had grown too stiff to trim the pen, and he must learn to make his letters thicker. Who recorded, with no more lament than he gave a cloud across Saturn, that the housekeeper's chocolate had been the only warm thing he had tasted in 3 days of clear, hard watching. Who wrote once, in the deep of a December night, that the dome was the coldest and the kindest room he had ever owned, and that a man alone with the heavens did not feel his solitude as a man alone in a parlour did, the company being so much larger and so much further off. She read the hand grow surer through the strong years, and waver again toward the end, the downstrokes thinning, the entries shortening, the bearings still taken faithful off the fell, though the taking plainly cost him more. And she understood, turning the leaves, that she was reading not a record of the sky at all, but a life lived wholly under it, a man's whole patient solitary devotion laid out in ink for the one reader he had guessed might come and know it for what it was. She handled the older volumes with a particular care after that, as one handles a thing that has been confided rather than merely left, and copied the faded passages fair into her own book, lest the ink fail before another eye should read them. She had come to love him out of these pages, this great uncle she had been raised to think a fireside invention, and she did not yet know why the loving should ache as it did, until the night Hattie set the candles down, and Marianne opened the volume lettered with the year of her own birth, and felt the floor of the years drop quietly away beneath her. She had not looked for it. She had reached for that span only because it lay next in the backward order, and she turned the leaves with no thought beyond the work, until a date she knew better than any other in the calendar rose up off the page in her great-uncle's hand and stopped her where she sat. It was the 11th of March, the night she had been born, 180 miles south of that dome in a cold parsonage in Hampshire, and Silas Ainsworth, who could by every account she'd ever heard have had no notion she existed, and no cause to mark the night at all, had been at his telescope through the whole black freezing length of it, and had written down what stood in the sky. Marianne read the entry once and could not breathe, and read it again with Hattie's hand come to rest upon her shoulder, and then she read it aloud, because the words would not stay quiet in her. He had set down the phase of the moon, 3 days past the new, a thin waxing crescent gone down early in the west, so that the dark had been good and deep. He had logged the position of the 4 moons of Jupiter, strung out east and west of the planet like beads on an invisible wire, and drawn them in their little row. He had marked Saturn low and yellow in the south, and the winter stars wheeling over toward their setting, Orion gone down the fell shoulder, and the dog at his heel. And then, beneath the figures, in the plain, dry hand he kept for the things that mattered most to him, he had written the line that undid her. This night, the 11th, my niece's girl is brought to bed of a daughter in Hampshire, the first of the next generation of us. The heavens being clear, I have taken the sky entire against the hour of the child's coming, that she may have it of me one day, if ever she has the wit to want it, there being no other gift in my power to send so far. Marianne sat with that a long while, the candle flame standing straight in the still air under the dome, and understood at last the shape of the silence she had grown up inside, that the great uncle who was never spoken of, the quarrel that had cut the Stricklands off from their one grand connection and left them genteel and poor and proud, had not been the cold withdrawal she had always taken it for. He had not forgotten them. He had only been forbidden, by whatever old hardness lay between him and her grandfather, to come near. And being shut out from the cradle, he had done the one thing a shut-out astronomer could do, and reached up over 180 miles of dark to take down the very sky that stood above her on the night she came, and keep it for her, and wait. He had watched over her from afar in the only heaven he had the freedom of. She turned forward then, with hands not quite steady, and found that he had not stopped at the one night. Through all the volumes of her childhood and her girlhood, the line recurred, sparse and faithful, a sentence here and a date there, pressed in among the comet and the planets and the cold mechanics of the spheres. The child will be 5 years old this week. I wonder, does she look up? My niece writes, the girl has had the scarlet fever and is mended. Deo gratias. They tell me she reads, and reads beyond her years, which I had rather hear than that she were handsome. He had got news of her by some slow underground channel of cousins and curates all those years, and set each scrap into his journals as gravely as he set the transit of a star. And Marianne saw that her whole unregarded life had been regarded after all, from this one high copper room she had never known existed, by a man she had been taught to believe had never been real, and she found, turning the last of those pages, the thing that bent her head at last over the table, that in the final volume, the autumn before he died, the hand grown shaky now, and the entries fewer, he had written, I am told the girl keeps a notebook of the moon and the moons of Jupiter, and was heard to correct the rector upon the matter of a comet, being a child. So it has come down hall, then, the only thing of mine worth the sending. Let Locksley see she has the house and the glass and all the books, for she is the one of them that was made to use it, and I shall not see her, but she will stand where I stood. She closed the book upon that, and did not weep. She had not wept once through the whole of it, not over the will, nor the journey, nor vain, nor any of it, but she sat for a long time, with her 2 hands flat upon the marbled cover, as one lays hands upon a grave, And then she rose and crossed to the great brass refractor on its mount, and stood a moment with her palm against the cold barrel of it, and went and pulled the cord that ran the long shutter back along its groove, and let the true sky down into the room. It was a clear night, and the moon 3 days past the full, and she stood under the open slot of the dome, and found Jupiter where the figures said it would be, and steadied the glass, and brought the 4 little moons up swimming into the field one by one, the same 4 he had drawn the night she was born, in the same eternal unhurried order. And she said to Hattie, who had crept up softly beside her, "He gave me the one thing he had, and never once asked me to be grateful for it. I think that is the kindest thing a person can do." And below them in the portrait-hung hall, where she had passed 100 times without stopping, there hung the likeness of him at last identified. A spare, upright old man with grey eyes, she had been told a dozen times were her own, looking out of the dark canvas over the head of whoever climbed the stair, toward the eastern wing and the dome, as he must have looked 1,000 nights in the flesh. And she went down and stood before it the next morning in the plain daylight, and looked her great-uncle in the face for the first and only time she ever could, and thanked him aloud in the empty hall. She told no one of the birth-night entry, but Hattie and Mrs. Pendlebury, when the housekeeper came up with the morning chocolate and found her mistress red about the eyes for the only time in all those weeks, and Mrs. Pendlebury, who had served the old man 30 years and held more of his silence than anyone living, set the tray down and said, in her plain way, that he had asked after the Hampshire child every Christmas of her service, and forbidden in the same breath that any letter be written south, being too proud to make the first step toward people who had cast him off, and too fond to let the want of them quite go, and that Marianne had only to look in the 3rd drawer of the master's bureau to see what he had done with the wanting. Marianne went and looked, and found there a slim packet of cuttings and copied lines in her own mother's hand, and Locksley's clerkly one, kept under a stone paperweight cut with the figure of a comet, every scrap of news of her that had ever come north, hoarded like observations of a body too faint to see except by patience, her christening, her mother's death, the living her father held, the very catalogue of a girl grown up unseen and unforgotten. She put the packet back where he had kept it, and weighted it again with the comet stone, and shut the drawer, and was a long time about it, and when she came away, she understood that grief and gladness were not, after all, 2 different weathers, but could stand in one sky at once, the way a man may log the setting of one star and the rising of another in the self-same line. She felt that the house had become, between one night and one morning, entirely and rightly hers. The Duke came first on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the settled weather of late spring, and he came so quietly that Marianne was halfway down the stair before Mrs. Pendlebury's face told her it was a caller of consequence, and not the curate nor the steward at the door. He had sent no grand word ahead, only a note the day before in a plain hand, asking whether Miss Strickland would receive him, and signing himself with a name she had heard once or twice in the valley spoken with the particular respect the North keeps for its old families and almost never spends on anyone, the 5th Duke of Calder, 41, tall and unhurried, iron grey at the temples over a dark blue coat, a grave, courteous face and a slow, considering manner, a widower these 6 years with a fondness for plain country talk. He stood in the low parlour, with his hat in his 2 hands, and did not fill the room with himself the way Vane had filled it, but seemed rather to take up less space than his height entitled him to, and when Marianne came in, he bowed and said, before any other thing, that he begged her pardon for calling without better acquaintance, but that he had seen her once, months gone, across the long room at the Appleby Assembly, in the press of the county, doing its dancing, and had asked who she was and been told, and had thought ever since that he should like to know the lady who had inherited Silas Ainsworth's glass and meant to keep it. "I knew your great-uncle a little," he said, turning his hat, or knew of him rather, as everyone hereabouts did, the gentleman on the fell who kept the dark and would not have a lamp lit on the Skelwith road after 10 o'clock for love nor money, lest it spoil his seeing. We thought him half mad and wholly admirable. I am sorry I never climbed up to him while he lived. I find I am sorry for a good many things I was too slow to do. And Marianne, who had been braced without knowing it for another man come to want something of her, found there was nothing to be braced against. He wanted nothing she could see but to stand in her parlour and speak the truth slowly, and she answered him in kind, and told him, because he had asked and seemed truly to wish to know, that the glass was a fine one, and the seeing on the fell was the best she had ever stood under, and that she had lately found in her great-uncle's journals that he had taken the sky on the night of her own birth, and kept it for her 30 years. And the Duke was quiet a moment at that, and then said only that it was the best reason he had ever heard for a man to keep a journal, and that he envied her the having of it. They walked out after, by Mrs. Pendlebury's contriving and Marianne's own consent, into the home park where the new bracken was uncurling green under the oaks, and the braathe sounded loud below, and he gave her his arm over the rough ground and asked her, not as a gallantry but as a man genuinely ignorant and willing to be taught, how a person learned to read the sky, and whether the moons of Jupiter could be seen with a common glass, or wanted the great one, and what it was she wrote in the small worn notebook he had marked she carried even into the park, and she told him the moon would be at the half that night and would set near one in the morning, and that if the cloud held off, he might, if he cared to come up another evening, see the 4 moons for himself, and judge whether the old gentleman had been mad or only happy. He listened to the whole of it with his grave head a little bent, asking now and again the one short question that showed he had truly followed, and not merely waited out her speaking. And when she had done, he was silent a while, walking, and then said that he had passed 40 years taking the night for an empty thing, a darkness to be got through with a candle and a fire, until the useful morning came round again, and that it had not once occurred to him that a person might go out into it on purpose, as into a country worth the visiting. She answered that it was the best furnished country she knew, and the only one whose roads were never out of repair, and the Duke gave the short, considered sound that she would come to know for his nearest approach to laughter, and said he begged her pardon for having lived so long with his eyes upon the ground. They went on under the oaks with the braathe loud below them, and the new bracken brushing wet against her hem, and he matched his long, unhurried stride to hers without seeming to think of it, and held back the low bows from her face, and asked her at the stile whether her great-uncle had ever in his journals named the Comet's return, and how far off it stood, and whether she reckoned to be living when it came, and she told him the year of it, far down the century, and the very season, set down in the old man's hand and copied now in hers, and said she did not expect to see it, but that someone standing in her dome would, and that this was a thing she had made her peace with long ago, and found she did not greatly mind. He did not, she noticed, do as so many men of consequence did when a woman spoke of a thing she knew better than they. He did not smile and steer the talk back to safer ground, nor pretend a knowledge he had not, nor flatter her cleverness as a pretty trick. He asked plain questions, and waited for the answers and turned them over slowly in his grave way. And once, when she named a star wrong from old habit, and corrected herself in the very next breath, he said he liked a person who would mend their own error sooner than carry it, and she found she liked that he had marked it at all. He said he should like that very much, and that he would not press her for it, and that he was a patient man, and reckoned the best things in the north were the ones you waited out a season for, and he bowed over her hand at the gig, and rode off down the lane at an unhurried walk, without once looking back to see whether she watched him go, which she found, standing under her great-uncle's green copper dome, with the notebook in her hand, and the long light going gold down the valley, She rather did. So the spring came up the valley of the Brathay, and Sir Goderic Vane did not come again, and the quiet that settled over Skelwith Howe in the weeks after his going was not the held breath of a house under threat, but the long ease of one that has weathered something and found itself still standing. The lawyers in Kendal saw to the last of it. The forged paper, with its Comet misdated by a full 12-month, lay folded now in Mr. Locksley's strong-box as a curiosity rather than a danger, and the claim built upon it had crumbled as quietly as it had been raised, leaving behind it nothing but the memory of a fleshy man in a primrose waistcoat who had wagered everything upon a date he had not troubled to check against the sky. Marianne thought of him seldom and without rancour. She had won not by cunning, but by the plain habit of knowing when a thing in the heavens had happened, and there was no triumph in it she cared to dwell upon, only the settling of a weight she had carried since the card was first left at the south door. The lambs came white into the high pastures, and the becks ran loud and brown with the thaw, and Mr. Brand walked the walls with her, and told her where the frost had thrown the stone, and Mrs. Pendlebury threw the windows of the long house open to the soft air, and Miss Hattie read aloud to her of an evening in the South Library, while the light went amber on the spines of her great-uncle's books. And into that quiet, without hurry and without any flourish at all, came the 5th Duke of Calder, riding up the narrow lane from the Kendal Road on a tall grey horse, as though he had all the time in the world, which, being who he was, he very nearly had. He had first seen her at the Appleby Assembly the autumn before her uncle died, across a crowded floor, and had asked who she was and been told nobody in particular, the parson's daughter from the south, a connection of old Ainsworth up the Brathay, and he had remembered her, in the patient way of a man of 41 who has buried one wife and is in no haste to be wrong about a second. And when the country talk reached him of how she had stood her ground against Vane and undone him with an old Comet, he had thought it as good a reason as any to ride over and renew an acquaintance that had never properly begun. He did not press. That was the first thing she understood of him, and the thing she came in time to value above all the rest. He called, and took the cup of tea Mrs. Pendlebury brought, and talked plainly of sheep and walls and the price of wool with Mr. Brand when Mr. Brand happened by, and asked her nothing of her heart, and proposed nothing to her hand, and when an hour had passed, he rose and thanked her and rode away again down the lane, and came back a fortnight after, and did the same. He was tall and unhurried, iron grey at the temples over the dark blue coat she came to know, with a grave, courteous face and a slow, considering manner that left long, comfortable silences in a conversation and was not troubled by them. A widower these 6 years, he had learned the worth of plain talk and the folly of fine, and he sat with her in the South Library through a succession of mild grey afternoons as the spring deepened into early summer, sometimes saying very little, content to watch her work, for she had taken to bringing the smaller of her great-uncle's journals down from the dome to copy fair the faded entries before the ink should fail altogether, and he found, to his own mild surprise, that he could watch a woman rule a margin and number a column of observations for the better part of an hour, and count the afternoon well spent, once, settling himself at the broad writing-table beneath the window with a letter of his own to answer. He asked her, in the easy way of a man making conversation about the weather, what it was she set down so carefully. And instead of turning the question with a modest nothing, as the women of his acquaintance had been trained from the cradle to do, she told him, she showed him the journal, and her uncle's hand, and the long columns of the moons of Jupiter, logged night upon night, and the great folded chart of the comet's track across 3 winter months, and she explained how the old man had timed each passage to the minute and what such timings were good for, and her grey eyes went quick and bright with the telling in a way he had not seen them go over tea or walls or wool. He did not laugh, nor humour her, nor steer her gently back to safer ground. He leaned in over the chart and asked her a question, a real one, about how a fixed star might be told from a wandering one by a man with no instrument but his eye. And when she answered it, he asked another, and the letter on the table went unwritten until the light failed. After that the visits changed their character, though slowly the way a season changes, with no single day one could point to as the hinge. He came no longer as a great man, paying a civil call upon a neighbour, but as a man with somewhere he wished to be, and the household, which read such things long before the principals will admit them, began to make him welcome in the small, unspoken ways that signify more than any word. Mrs. Pendlebury kept a particular chair by the library window, and let no one else take it. Mr. Brand fell into the habit of saving up his harder questions about drainage and the law of common pasture for the Duke's days, knowing he would get a plain answer from a man who had managed land all his life. And Miss Hattie, reading aloud of an evening, learned to let the book lie when his grey horse was heard upon the lane. He brought her things, by and by, that were not the flowers and trinkets a younger suitor brings, but better suited to the woman he had troubled to understand, a German treatise on the moons of Saturn that he had hunted out through a Kendal bookseller and could not read a word of himself, the German being beyond him, an old brass eyepiece found among his late father's curiosities that proved upon trial to want only cleaning to serve the great refractor better than the worn one it replaced, and once, gravest of all, a single sheet of close figures copied for him at his own request by a learned acquaintance at the university, being the predicted return of her comet, reckoned afresh by a newer method, which agreed, to her quiet pleasure and his open delight, almost to the month with the date her great-uncle had set down 40 years before. She kept the sheet in the journal where her own calculation lay, the two hands side by side, the dead astronomers and the living ones, and thought it the truest courting gift she had ever heard of, though she did not tell him so in those words. That was the turn of it, though neither of them named it so. A man may admire a handsome face across a ballroom and forget it by the next, but the Duke of Calder had buried a wife he had loved, and learned in the long quiet after that there is a thing rarer than beauty and harder to keep, which is the company of a mind that does not weary one, and he had ridden over the fells 6 times before he understood that he had found it in the parson's daughter, who corrected sky facts by reflex and kept the dates of the heavens the way other women kept the dates of balls. He took to coming oftener. They walked, when the weather held, up the steep path behind the house, to where the fell opened out and the whole valley lay below them green and folded, the Brathay bright at the bottom of it, and she would name him the line of the hills, and he would name her the farms and the families on them, and they found there two kinds of knowledge sat easily side by side, his rooted and local, and hers wide and high and old as light. They walked once at dusk, later than they ought, and the first stars came out over the eastern fell, and she stopped on the path without thinking, and lifted her face to them and named them off under her breath, Arcturus and the cool blue lamp of Vega, and lo, in the south, the red coal of a star, she gave its Arabic name. And the Duke stood a pace behind her in the falling dark and watched her do it, and said, when she had done, only that he had passed 40 years under those same stars and never once known their names, and that he found he should like to learn them if she would teach him, and that he could think of no pleasanter way to spend the evenings of such life as remained to him. It was as near as he had yet come to saying the thing itself, and she heard the whole of it under the plain words, and did not pretend she had not. She turned on the path and looked at him steadily in the last of the light. This grave, unhurried man, who had asked her real questions and waited a whole spring without pressing, and she said that she thought the dome would hold 2 at a pinch, and that the nights here were very clear, and that he would find her a patient teacher, but an exact one, for she would not have him calling a planet a star. And he laughed at that, a low, surprised laugh she had not heard from him before, and said that he would sooner be corrected by her than agreed with by the whole peerage, and that was the end of the not-saying, and the beginning of the rest. He was a man of his word in small things as in great, and so before any settlement was drawn or any banns thought of, on the first clear night that offered after that walk, she made good her promise and took him up under the dome to begin his teaching. It went, that first evening, as such things do with a beginner of 41, who has never bent his eye to a glass. He could not at first find the planet at all, and turned the slow-motion screw too far and lost it, and grew quietly exasperated with himself in the way of a capable man made clumsy by a new thing. And she stood at his shoulder in the cold dark, and did not laugh at him, but set her hand over his upon the brass, and showed him the trick of the small patient movement, the eighth of a turn and the weight, until the bright disk swam into the field and steadied, and she heard him draw the breath she had been waiting for. She gave him the moons one by one, and the names her uncle had used for them, and the banded face of the great planet itself. And then, because he had earned it by his patience, she swung the long tube down toward the south, and gave him the rings of Saturn, which no painting and no treatise had prepared him for, and he was silent a long while at the glass, and then said, in a voice gone rough, that he had not known there was such a thing in the world to be seen, and had lived 40 years, and never thought to look. She told him there was a great deal in the world to be seen by anyone who would take the trouble to look, and that this was the whole of her uncle's religion, and very near the whole of her own. And they stood on under the open shutter until the cold drove them down, and from that night the teaching went forward steadily. An hour or two on every clear evening, the grave, unhurried Duke, proving as exact and biddable a pupil as she could have wished, who never again called a planet a star. He spoke to Mr. Locksley first, as a careful man does, and then he spoke to her plainly in the South Library, with the window open on the June evening, and he made her no flowery speeches, and no settlements she had not seen and understood. He laid it before her, the way her steward laid out the accounts, what he was, and what he had, and what he asked, which was her company for the years left to him, and her hand upon the management of his houses, and her own clear independence, kept whole within the marriage. For he had no wish, he said, to be the man who shut a thing under glass. She knew where the phrase had come from before he finished it. Her great-uncle's own words, given to Mr. Locksley over the drawing of a will, and carried somehow into the country talk, and so to the Duke, and she felt the old man at her shoulder as plainly as if his crooked painted figure had stepped down once more into the room, and she gave the Duke her hand on it, as she had given it to Locksley on the bargain to go north, plainly and without weeping, and asked him her one clarifying question, which was whether he understood that she meant to keep the dome in use, and the journals copied, and the great refractor turned upon the sky for as long as her eyes would serve, and that this was not a girlhood fancy to be set aside with marriage, but the chief work of her life. He said that he had rather counted upon it. He said further, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, and his grey eyes steady on hers in the failing June light, that he had married once for the reasons the world thought sufficient, and had been happy enough in it, and had buried that happiness and grieved it honestly. But that he had thought, in the 6 lonely years since, that if ever he married again, it would be for the one reason the world thought least of, which was that he had found a person he did not tire of and could not better, and that he had ridden over the fells that spring expecting to be civil to a brave young woman and disabused of a fancy, and had instead been thoroughly and contentedly undone. It was the longest speech she had heard him make, and the nearest to fine words he ever came, and she valued it the more for the visible cost of it to a man so sparing, and she did not answer it with words at all, but rose and crossed to the open window where the first star of the evening hung over the eastern fell, and stood looking at it a moment, and then said, with her back to him and her voice quite even, that the star he could see over her shoulder was a planet and would not twinkle if he watched it, and that he might as well come and learn to see it properly, since he was to have the use of the dome for the rest of his life. And he came and stood beside her. And they watched the planet not twinkle, and the thing was settled between them as plainly as a sum. The banns were read in the fell church of St. Oswald on 3 Sundays of that high summer, the curate Mr. Wenlock giving them out in his clear, unhurried voice from the worn stone of the chancel where her uncle lay, outside under his plain slab with the comet cut true upon it, and the small congregation of farmers and shepherds and the people of the home estate heard the names joined, Marianne Strickland of Skelwith Howe and Hugh Aldermore, 5th Duke of Calder, and were glad of it in the undemonstrative way of the fells, with a nod and a word at the lich gate rather than any great noise. There was no grand wedding. She would not have one, and he, to the quiet despair of his distant relations, wanted one no more than she did. And so, on a clear morning in the last week of August, with the bracken just beginning to turn on the high ground, and the air washed bright after a night's rain, she walked down the lane to St. Oswald's on Mr. Brand's square, honest arm, for she had no nearer man to give her, in a gown of soft dove-grey with no veil and no train, and was married to the Duke by Mr. Wenlock before a church full of her own people. Mrs. Pendlebury wept and was not ashamed of it. Miss Hattie held the small posy of late roses and harebells cut that morning from the kitchen garden wall. Mr. Locksley had come up from Kendal in his good black to stand beside her, 33 years of other people's griefs and gains behind his gold-rimmed spectacles, and he gave her away from the law's side, as Brand gave her from the household's, and afterward he told the Duke, with the dry warmth of an old man who has earned the right to plain speech, that he had drawn many a marriage settlement in his time, and never one he liked the look of better. They came back up the lane to a dinner laid in the long parlour for the whole estate, tenants and servants at the one board, with the Duke at the head of it carving like any farmer, and the talk was of hay and weather, and the lambs that had come well that year. And Marianne sat among the people who had been her allies since the first night, and were now her family, and was as content as she had ever been in her life. And the marriage, when it came to be lived, was of a piece with the courting that had led to it, which is to say it was quiet and exact, and built upon a true understanding rather than a pretty one. They divided the year between his houses and hers, but it was Skelwith Howe that became home to them both, for it was there that the dome stood, and the Duke, who might have carried his Duchess off to grander rooms and a wider society, found that he wanted neither so much as he wanted the clear nights above the Brathay and the long companionable hour at the glass with the wife who had given him the sky. She kept her own independence whole, as he had promised she should, and managed her uncle's estate with Mr. Brand's counsel and her own good sense, and the observatory she kept, as her uncle had charged it should be kept, in use and undivided. The journals were copied fair at last, every faded page of them, in her neat hand and the Duke's clumsier one beside it, for he took to setting down the night's observations to her dictation when her own hand was tired, and was prouder of those columns of figures than of any acre he owned. The country, which had braced itself for a duchess and a deal of trouble, got instead a woman who corrected the parson on the date of an eclipse, and could tell a tenant's boy why the harvest moon hung so low and orange, and came in time to be rather proud of her. And on clear winter nights, the green-domed house on the fell showed a faint light at its shuttered slot long after the valley had gone to bed, and the shepherds who saw it knew it, for the Duchess at her stars, and thought no more of it than that it was a thing she did, the way other great ladies kept hounds or hothouses. That evening, the evening of the wedding, when the dishes were cleared and the last of the farm folk had gone down the lane with their lanterns swinging, and the August dark had come clean down the fell unspoiled by any smoke of towns, she did the thing she had meant to do since the morning. She took her husband up the narrow twisting stair of the eastern wing with a single candle to the copper dome, and she drew back the long shutter in its curve so that the night came pouring in cold and enormous over the brass refractor on its mount, and she set his eye to the glass her great-uncle had ground his fortune away upon, and she showed the 5th Duke of Calder the moons of Jupiter strung out from the planet's side like beads off a thread, exactly as a torn almanac and a single borrowed evening had once shown them to a parson's daughter, freezing on the churchyard grass at Nether Wallop, with no soul to tell her to come in. He looked a long while and said nothing, which she had learned was his way of being most moved. And she stood beside him in the dark of the dome that was hers, in the house that was hers, on the fell her uncle had chosen, because no smoke of cities stood between the eye and the dark, and she understood that the old man had reached across 40 years and the whole length of England, not to give her a fortune, but to give her this, the room and the glass, and the clear unspoiled sky above a loud green river, and that she had received the gift entire, and would keep it entire, and pass it, in its turn, undivided to whoever came after. Below them, in the south library where she did her copying, and where her husband would sit of an evening with his unwritten letters and be content, the cheap travelling painter's portrait that had hung so long over a cold parlour grate in Hampshire, now hung in the place of honour over the writing-table, brought north at her own particular order. The 3 generations of careful Hampshire jaws, and at the edge, half cut off where the canvas had run short, the young man turned aside with his eyes lifted to a window out of the frame and the small brass instrument cradled in the crook of his arm. He was a fiction no longer, and never would be again in that house. He was Silas Ainsworth, who had built a dome above the Brathay and dated a comet true, and his portrait kept its watch over the warm lamplit room below, while above it, under the open shutter, his great-niece turned his telescope upon the wheeling summer stars and named them off one by one into the dark, the south library and its portrait below her, and the observatory above, the dome hers, the journals hers, the whole high-patient inheritance of the sky now wholly and forever her own.